to Awaken Authenticity. I'm Alyssum, and I'm very happy to introduce to you one of my dearest friends, Althea Skinner, who I met when I was here in DC for the first time as an intern, where she still works.
True.
And my interest in interviewing Althea today is to talk about authenticity of the heart. She's had sort of a roller coaster of sorts in the past since I've known you.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of delve into that. So let's see, start at the beginning. How, for someone who doesn't know you, introduce yourself first.
My name is Althea, and I am a dancer and a lover of people and nature. As Alyssum said, I work to promote just and sustainable food systems in ways that empower women and alleviate poverty and conserves important biodiversity. I also dance professionally in the DC area. I'm trained as a classical ballet dancer, but I do contemporary and modern and postmodern these days.
We have a cat down here. She's and so if you've expressed some of your relationship stuff through dance, how does that feel? Let's start there. How does it feel to be expressing something so personal in a public forum?
Dance is a funny art in that it's extremely abstruse for a lot of people, or obtuse, and that so it's possible to express something deeply personal in a way that doesn't feel invasive. I would also say that because of that, despite the fact that I have choreographed things that are about my personal relationships, that I often feel like I'm not necessarily expressing as effectively as I could about those experiences. It feels like a struggle in part because my creative process is still something that I'm trying to figure out how to sync with my authenticity, I guess, or how to be most expressive.
What do you think is missing in those situations, or is it
I just
consistent?
think it's a practice. It's an issue of practice. It's a question of creating space for regular, creating regular space for creative process, which is something that I don't have enough time for in my life because I have a full-time job and because I am committed to expressing other people's ideas through dance. I haven't made enough time to sink into my own process and figure out how to express my own ideas through dance.
And so, that said, as someone in the world, you are particularly expressive. I think more than any of the other people that I know, you wear your heart on your sleeve. Like the first day I met you, you gave me a helmet, a bike helmet. And the second time we hung out, we were just having lunch on the back porch, and you just welled up and started crying about things that were happening. And that's not something that most people feel comfortable doing with someone they just met. So how does it feel to walk, and you've shared other stories similar, how does it feel to walk through life as someone who wears their heart on their sleeve that incredibly?
I think that it feels authentic to me. I don't know how to be in the world without wearing my heart on my sleeve. I don't really feel like it's a choice for me. I think that I have a deep emotional life, that I experience emotional ups and downs at like more extreme levels than some people, and that therefore my ability to quote unquote control those emotions is not as well fine-tuned maybe as some people's, but I don't wish to control my emotions in that way. I'm comfortable sharing what is really going on for me.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I had one serious bout with depression in 2007 to 8. And one of the things that really paralyzed me during that time was not knowing how to answer people because I was in such a deep, dark place and I didn't want to lie. I'm not comfortable misrepresenting what's happening in my life, even to strangers. I'm comfortable not expressing completely what's happening in my life, right? I don't think that holding back some things from some people is, and I don't think that's a form of lying or anything, but I didn't.
Healthy.
Yeah, it can be healthy. Exactly. Boundaries are good. But when people asked me how I was, I didn't feel comfortable saying good because I wasn't good. I wasn't well. And that really paralyzed me because I had always been a fairly happy person. And despite the fact that I would, feel grief deeply, for example, when it was appropriate to feel grief deeply, I was mostly, my baseline was relatively happy. And then in the moment when it wasn't, I didn't know how to be real with people about what was going on in a way that wasn't wallowing and in a way that wasn't fake.
Yeah, no, that totally resonates with me. I was giggling because it was reminding me of when I was in veterinary school, and vet school, for those who don't know me, was a 4-year hellish experience, and I did my best, and it was always difficult. And I remember in the first semester going to the grocery store, which closed at 10 o'clock, and I taught dance class until 9:30, and so I had half an hour in which to drive over to the grocery store and do my shopping. And it was like the 15 minutes of my week where I was like, I could sort of relax.
15 minutes.
But I only had 15 minutes to zip through the school. Yeah, through the shop. And then when I would get to the checkout counter person would say, how are you today?
Right?
And I would just get stopped up, or sometimes I would just cry. It was just like, I hate this. Like, I'm not okay.
Right.
How do I answer? I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been there.
Yeah.
And so then how did you figure out how to navigate wallowing versus being authentic and not?
I don't think I figured it out then. I think that I needed medication to get past my paralysis, to sort of trick myself into thinking things were okay enough to get them okay again.
Yeah.
And I remember that once I sort of was past that deep, deep depression and was only slightly depressed, that I was more capable of reconnecting with my core authentic self. And I did a lot of dancing, and I did a lot of art, and I did a lot of cooking. That was the first time in my life that I really cooked. And I found all of those things really therapeutic, and I did a lot of journal writing, and I was also doing service, which to me is an important part of myself and way of being in the world. At that time, I was working at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And it turned out to be kind of a bad fit because it's pretty depressing to read about genocide every day, but
Wait, was that the reason that you were depressed at the time?
No.
Okay.
No.
I mean, it would have been totally reasonable.
Well, right. I think I got depressed again because of that. But anyway, point being that medication was a useful tool for me, and that's the only time I've ever relied on medication. But I think it is sometimes necessary.
Yeah.
I think that the more recent experience that I've had with sort of being in an uncomfortably dark space was when I broke up with my partner of 7 years, and the circumstances were fairly complicated, and I was in the process of moving internationally from Brazil back to the United States, and the one thing in my life that was constant in that moment was my job. And so when people would ask me how my last 2 years had been or how it was to be back, that also was an overwhelming question because, again, I didn't want to be inauthentic in my answer, but I also wasn't ready to bare my complete soul and tell everyone at work my story about what was going on in my personal life. And so, luckily, I navigated that challenging period, I think, more effectively than I did when I was 22. So 10 years later, doing better. And I haven't yet stopped to think about what made, how exactly I dealt with that. But I think that it's a little bit what we were talking about before of sort of having a better sense of how much information people needed to know. Mm-hmm. So saying, it's challenging to be back, but there are some really good things. And then focusing on the positive things, which were real. I'm really grateful to still have a full-time job. And I recognize what a blessing it is to have that piece of continuity in my life when everything else is up in the air.
Right. And also, I mean, talking about something, I mean, I found this for myself when I've been kind of down in the dumps. When people are asking you how you're doing, they don't necessarily expect to hear the answer of your life is falling apart. Right. And I don't think that I was necessarily very good at navigating that, but I like the idea of focusing on the things that are accessible to most, which is job, where you're living, right? That sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And then when it comes to the rest, saying that it's a challenge, that's really honest, and if they really care, they can ask more.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that I've gotten. I mean, it's funny that you brought up the story of how we met and how quickly I shared sort of what was going on in my personal life with you. But I think that being someone who's connected to my heart, I think we all have an immediate impression of people when we meet them, and my immediate impression of you was very positive, and I felt extremely at ease quickly, and I trusted that I trusted that you could sort of be present with what I had to offer.
I could handle it.
Right. Yeah. That you could be a witness to what was going on in my life. And I had that intuitive sense rather quickly. Yeah. And so I think that while that story suggests that I might be sort of flippant or something with those choices, not that you're suggesting that, but one could read it that way. I think it is more a reflection on your character and my
that's sweet.
Trust in my reading of others than it is sort of a telling story about how I treat most people in opening up. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a line to be walked in terms of wearing your heart on your sleeve. But I will say that most people can see in my face when I'm not.
Yeah.
Right? And, it's not like I can hide that very well. So while I may choose what to say, I think most people can read it energetically that something is off when I'm not well.
Right. Yeah. No, that's totally fair. And I think that it's a good point to recognize that, today I was talking to someone online about how you can feel authentic to yourself and present yourself in different ways in different situations or with different people. And so while I might feel like when I'm in a job that is in an office, I'm going to dress certain ways, I'm going to behave certain ways, and they might be more professional than how I'm going to show up in my house. Um, uh, but it's not inauthentic necessarily. Although I have also gone that far. I remember when I first had to wear a suit. I thought I had to wear a suit to work, and I felt more like I was in costume than when I was ever performing on stage with like rhinestones and masks and stuff. And so I realized, like, okay, that feels really inauthentic. I have to figure out something that projects professionality but feels like me, or else I just don't feel like I can do my job well enough. Yeah, so that's sort of what you're talking about too. It's just like figuring out that space where you can present yourself in an authentic way to yourself, but also be appropriate for the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's a good summary.
Yeah. So and then I also wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this huge transition in your life. You had a partner for 7 years, and you're with a different partner now. And I don't know. Talk to me about having an authentic heart in that entire chaotic, difficult, amazing, weird place.
Yeah.
Any other adjectives you want to add to that?
Yeah. Well, so I feel like I need to give a little context in order to talk about that.
Okay, thanks.
I think that what I should say is that I loved my ex a lot, and she loved me a lot. And I also really struggled to be in that relationship. It was always challenging. And it was challenging for reasons that are related to authenticity, that there were parts of myself that were not fully present and I don't want to blame her for that necessarily. That's not what, I don't want to have anyone misconstrue that that's what I'm saying. It was hard for me to show up fully, in part because she didn't necessarily validate or value those parts of me, but for other reasons that I was never able to articulate fully as well. And so, for example, one of the really interesting things that has happened just in the last couple weeks, I was in Nepal for work, and after I finished facilitating this workshop, I spent 2 days in a monastery. And during those 2 days, I was reading about Buddhist philosophy, and I was attending the puja or prayer sessions of the monks, and I went to the cave where the second reincarnation of the Buddha reached enlightenment. And so it was a full and eventful 2 days, very focused on sort of Buddhist philosophy in practice. And the way in which that manifested for me was, for one, that I realized that whenever I had been alone in the past 7 years, I opened myself to reconnecting with my authentic self, my whole self, my integrated self. And that,
Excuse me.
that in the past, I needed to make space to connect with the parts of myself that were either repressed or not as present when I was with my partner. Mm-hmm. That was important for me in order to stay whole and true to myself. Mm-hmm. And what that meant was it inevitably brought up doubts about my partnership. Mm-hmm. So to be alone was a time when I always reconnected with doubts about whether or not I should be in that partnership, or how I could improve it, or and I should say that those doubts were often about myself. They were not judgments necessarily about my partner. They were often about I mean, one of the reasons I stayed so long is that I know that I'm a perfectionist. I am aware of that tendency in myself. And so one of the running narratives that I had about that relationship was, you will never be satisfied by any partnership because you will always find things to be critical about because you are a perfectionist. And so the things that didn't feel right while they were big, and while there were big parts of me that were missing, I just thought, no matter who I'm with, that will be true. I will always find pieces of me that are not as fully present as if I were alone, right? As if I were authentic with myself independently of anyone else.
Right.
And I will always find things that don't fit quite right because people are people and we're imperfect. And I'm a perfectionist, so I will always be unhappy, right? Yeah. So that was sort of the narrative. So anyway, that's all a way to say that in this time when I was in Nepal, one of the things that I realized was that I had this small little crisis with my current partner because I sort of introduced some space for doubts as I entered into that time of going to the monastery, and I was going to be offline for a couple days and really like have time to connect with myself, which I knew was important. And it was really the first time that I had been alone since I broke up with my partner of 7 years and got together with my new partner. And so I knew that I needed to create space for myself to connect with myself and know what was going on. And out of habit, that meant to me that I needed to create space for doubts. And while I was gone, I realized that that's not what that meant.
Wow.
I don't actually have doubts about this relationship. I feel incredibly secure and sure that this is my life partner and that I want to be in this, and, you know, I'm deeply in love and blah, 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 blah. And so that out of habit, I had created space for doubts when in fact I don't have doubts. And really what I needed to do was just to connect with my whole authentic self. And the irony or the beauty of it is that I do that all the time with my current partner.
Yay!
There aren't parts of me that are in the dark or less present. I feel whole and integrated, and I'm not critical, and I'm not, you know, missing things. And so that whole narrative turns out to have been, I think that we go through what we go through because we need to. I think I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't stuck that out and experienced everything I experienced. But turns out I can be my authentic, whole, open-hearted self in my partnership.
Inside a partnership.
Not
just alone.
Independently.
Right. Yeah. I also wonder if or how much being a perfectionist led you to sticking with an imperfect relationship that long because of the idea, like, it's a failure to not be in a relationship, so I have to be perfect at this relationship kind of thing.
I don't think I had a concern about being a failure to not be in the relationship, but I think that because I did feel like I had failed my ex at various points during our relationship, that I put additional pressure on myself to make it work in order to not fail her again.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think being authentic means?
I was afraid you would ask that. I think it means...
Or what does it mean for you?
Yeah, well, so I did a little bit of thinking about that on my way over here because I thought you might ask that. And I didn't have nearly as much time as I would have because life is busy, as I would have liked to. But I think at the core, being authentic is about being true to yourself, whatever that means to you. And that, for me, that means being an embodied human being, so being, present in my body, often in motion, not always, but often. And it also means, to me, being open-hearted and expressive.
Mm.
And it means to me being, in fact, doing service for marginalized or vulnerable people and for nature. I, in the last year, have gone through the process of articulating my personal mission, which I don't have memorized. Sorry, but it has to do with all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, I think at some level, if we go through that process of articulating our mission, we hit on what are those core things to our authentic being.
Yeah. I actually had a class in grad school where we came up with our mission, and I'm curious to go back and look at it and see where. Yeah. Because I was going to ask you just now, like, is that mission statement something that you would feel comfortable sharing with us, and we can put it in the comments below or something like that? And then I thought, well, regardless of whether your answer is yes or no, I thought, what if I had put my mission statement from 3 or 4 years ago down in online somewhere? I have no idea whether it would still be true or not.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's not something that I am yet in the practice of doing, but having articulated it once and having read a little bit about that, I know it's important to revisit that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that brings, probably my intuition is that if I read it, there would be a lot that would still resonate. Yeah. And there's probably little, more specific example that might be in there somehow that maybe are less relevant now. But I feel like that's just a good jump off into the idea that an authentic self can change over time, and that you're authentic, and there's probably threads that will remain fairly true for most of your life, if not all of it, but that that there's definitely room to grow and room to change within being authentic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
So another thing that I have asked most of the people that I have been interviewing, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to share, is what are some of your greatest successes and or greatest failures
in life?
Yeah.
Okay.
My point of asking this is to get the to have an understanding of what experiences have pushed you to where you are right now, and kind of been catalyzing in one way or another.
Yeah.
Usually I feel like the successes and failures that we have in life tend to be catalyzing moments.
Yep.
And so that's where I'm coming from.
Yep. So I will actually harken back to some things that I've already talked about to give a little more context, because I think they're related to that prompt. I think that you asked if I was depressed because I was working at the ICTY, and no, I wasn't.
And say again what ICTY
the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I was depressed because among other reasons, the thing that I eventually put my finger on was that I had worked for my whole life to graduate from a good school with honors. I was valedictorian in high school, and then I, had the highest honors at Rice University. And when I graduated, when I had completed that goal, I didn't know what was next. Right. It was like I had already reached my life goal. What do you do now? And so and the failure that's linked to that success is that, while all of so Rice was a kind of a bizarre pick for me in terms of my undergraduate experience. I applied to a ridiculous number of schools and got into 13 of them and was waitlisted at 2, and So it was like, I had my pick of the crop. But I ended up going to Rice essentially because it challenged people's assumptions about me and because it was cheaper than most other schools of the caliber. And anyway, but my colleagues, my peers many of them were applying to be consultants and were going to make, $90,000 a year consulting for whatever, making money in transactions, and I didn't understand it and I didn't want to do it. Didn't have anything to do with my personal mission that I hadn't articulated. And so I knew enough about myself to know that. And so when they were applying to that, I applied to something called the Watson, which was to travel around the world and go to as many countries as you wanted, doing something you wanted. And I applied to study dance and human rights and how they related. And I didn't get it, but my girlfriend at the time did. And that was a little demoralizing because that was my plan A. And I didn't have a plan B. That was the thing that I wanted to do the year after I graduated. And I had, as I said, already achieved my life goal, and I didn't know what else would move me along my path. And so I think that, hitting rock bottom and being really paralyzed and not sort of being in touch with my core authentic self during that period of depression, and then, sort of getting over the perfectionism of, I'm not going to take drugs in order to get myself out of this. Like, I should be able to pull myself up by my bootstraps, sort of admitting that I needed help and being willing to take help in forms that I wasn't proud of. And then, as I said, when I was in Europe, before I did the International Criminal Tribunal, the UN court internship, I had several months where I was dancing 3 hours a day. I was supplementing. I wouldn't have had any income during that time except that I was selling art on the streets.
And I didn't know that about you.
Yeah. I was selling watercolors and jewelry that I had made, and it wasn't a lot of income, but it felt like a really authentic way to be present in that experience of being outside of school and being true to myself, and it was bringing me joy, which was something that when I was depressed was hard to come by. And the same with food. I was cooking for myself, but I was also cooking, like I remember in Berlin, there was this amazing weekly film event that happened in the basement of an abandoned church. And one week I made green curry and sold green curry at the film night. And the next week I did a dance improvisation, and the next week so I was just sort of using the things that gave me joy to also, to the extent possible, supplement what otherwise would have been a zero income time. And I also started nannying in bilingually in Spanish and English in Germany because those were skills that I had that other people didn't have. And so I think that time of being sort of industrious when I had what it felt like very little, emotional bandwidth, was really formative for me in trusting myself and in regaining my connection with self and in pulling myself out of that depression eventually. So that's one sort of success/failure moment. I think the other big two are kind of related. So when I was a kid, I loved to dance. It was it was the thing that I just lived for. And both my parents are academics. They both have PhDs. And I pretty early on got the message from them, whether it was verbal or otherwise, that like dance wasn't an appropriate profession for me.
We're so similar.
That's why we're friends. Maybe. And so I guess I internalized that. And I kept dancing. I always was devoted to dancing. But when it came time to go to undergraduate, to, go to university, I did not select my university based upon if they had a dance program or not, or the quality of their dance program even. And in retrospect, I actually regret that. Not that I would have only majored in dance, but had I gone to Berkeley, which was the other choice besides Rice, a more logical choice, frankly, for me, I would have double majored in dance and sociology or whatever, as opposed to just sociology. And so there's a part of me that sort of looks back and thinks, wow, of course my parents intended to set me up for success in life, and they did. But there is a part of my authentic sort of self that didn't get as fully developed as it might have had I listened more deeply to what I wanted to do. And I don't regret that, because what I did instead, there were a couple things that I did instead. So I recognize that, I recognized when I was in undergrad that I had a couple options. If I wanted to double major, which I would have double majored in, women and gender studies and sociology probably at Rice, then I couldn't have gone abroad. And if I wanted to go abroad, then I would only be able to have one major. And it was really important to me to go abroad. Yeah. And so I ended up going abroad for a whole year, 2 different semesters, and I had a lot of incredibly formative experiences, right? Also,
where did you go?
I spent the first semester in Mexico, Argentina, and Spain. It was a traveling program focused on Spanish language and culture and history. And the second was in Chile, and that was focused on human rights and development. And Spanish language also. And so, anyway, my point in telling this is that I was in parallel, in addition to achieving within 4 years a degree and a year abroad, which was extremely formative, and I can tell you about how I ended up on the path I ended up on from that. The other thing that I achieved was that I started dancing semi-professionally in Houston outside of Rice. And I am quite sure that I wouldn't have gone outside of the university context if I had gone to a school that had a dance program.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And that was an incredibly challenging but rewarding experience to have done that. And it meant that when I came to DC, and after I dealt with some really important other challenges around my body that included hip surgery and being out for the count in terms of movement and dance, and therefore, really big challenge to my identity that I had to also overcome.
Right.
I went back to dancing semi-professionally. And so I share all of this to say that I think my other big success in life, which is linked to some of these smaller, maybe failures, is having achieved a professional career that is well developed and meaningful to me, and contributes positively to the world, and also been able to have a fairly illustrious other side career in dance, and I feel really proud of that. And I am grateful, to my parents for having, in the end, given me the focus on an academic path that would serve me in the long run, especially because in the end it didn't actually undermine my ability to dance in the short run.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that focus, or like your self-reflection, I guess, that your short-term failures became long-term successes. I think that that's a really important thing to recognize and share as a reminder that when you're in the failure, in the time that feels terrible, you don't know where it's leading, and that doesn't make it any better in the moment, but it can definitely, it's comforting to know that probably it will have something to do with successes in the future.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the questions of the heart, I think that is very much what happened over the last couple of years for me, in that I was in this relationship, and while I was in that relationship, connected with my current partner, and I, felt awful about having feelings for this other person when I was in a committed relationship. Mm-hmm. But what that was the seed of was, from the very beginning, it was clear to me that my whole self was present in those feelings, and that my whole self was seen and valued by my current partner. And that's what gave me the courage to finally listen to all those doubts that I had experienced over time with my ex. And, I feel mortified and heartbroken that those relationships overlapped at all. But, that feels like a failure to me, right? We're in a society of serial monogamy, not overlapping relationships. And so, that feels really awful. But the long-term success is I found the love of my life, and I'm whole and present and, valued and authentic and validating of her, and all of those things that I always hoped and dreamed my partnership would do, and be inspired and inspiring, and, so that short-term failure has turned into what is clear to me is going to be a long-term success.
Yeah. And do you think that without that you would have ever completed your relationship with your ex?
Completed, like
ended?
I don't know.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know. As I said, there were always doubts, and so I think that part of me knew, there was some pressure to get married, and I had concluded that I didn't want to do that. And that was before I met my current partner. So my guess is that eventually I would have broken it off, but it's all kind of
who knows
at this point.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing so much of your story and life and heart with us today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. And before we go, I would like to ask you, if you were sitting across the table from somebody who felt frustrated and stuck in their life, what advice would you give them?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was to think about a another time in your life when you have been frustrated and stuck, and what helped you break that.
Yeah.
Because I think that often we have everything we need in our own experience to fall back on, and we often look outside of ourselves for what we need, when really looking inward is a more appropriate response.
Love that.
I think the other thing is that is just the opposite of that, which is that often when we're stuck, I think it's because of some self-limiting belief, because of some frame that we have on the problem, and that by changing the frame or by challenging that belief, we can reframe the issue and find a new out or a new perspective that will help us shift what's going on.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are a lot of different ways to do that, but I think that it can be by talking to someone who's trusted. Like, I might come to you and listen and say, listen, I'm really struggling with this thing. Can we talk about it? You know, can you help me see if there's another way to look at this? And that can also help to break loose movement, which, you know, when you're stuck, movement is kind of what you need to start to break through.
Right. Thank you again.
My pleasure.